Hello. Well, this is Janet Fitch, and it is noon on Wednesday. Therefore, it is Writing Wednesday when I answer your writing questions, psychological questions, personal questions, business questions, existential questions, all the writing questions. And believe me, if you have a question, uh, everybody will have the same question, or many people will have the same questions. So I do this every Wednesday at noon Pacific, 3 o'clock Eastern, and you can write your questions in the chat as we go along. Happy to answer. And if you have questions for me during the week, send them to me at my website, janetfitchwrites.com, and I will be happy to answer your question and really do a Writing Wednesday around your question. So I'm happy to work with your questions. Questions come to me through the internet. And hi, Alicia, good to see you. So happy to answer questions, all questions writing. And because we are human beings, all questions really lead to writing. Hi, Marie. So today I should say I'm reading quite an excellent book right now called Didion and Babbitts, about two major American writers, Joan Didion, and a more LA related writer, Eve Babbitts. And I would never think of them in the same sentence, but evidently they had a correspondence. Two polar opposite types of writers. Um, and I've just started, but the author's voice is so strong. Um, I had thought it was sort of a mm, questionable topic, like to think of them in the same sentence just didn't make much sense. Hi, Jill. But now reading it, I have the author's voice is so confident and interesting that I am sure that she has incredibly interesting things to say about these two authors and their relationships and their personalities and their writing and um, kind of the love, evidently kind of a love-hate relationship that the two of them had with one another, and two different, very different kinds of writers. Um, so enjoying that. I'm also reading a book by by Madeline Gins, Gins. So this is very avant-garde writing, and I had actually been in a book club recently where they talked about books that we have read that's syntactically, they're talking about the difference in syntax and semantics. And it was a very interesting conversation where uh, we were reading out of a difficult mathematical book, Gödel Escher Bach, and one of one of them was talking about the difference between syntax and semantics. So boiled down to its most simplistic, um, syntax is form and semantics is content or meaning. So when we talked about mathematics, it was like the form of the mathematics, and then what did it mean? Was there a second level of significance to the work? And that just made so much sense to me as a way of thinking about writing and the way you write, and then the content or the meaning that you're trying to bring across, and how form um, presses on meaning, how it teases out meaning in ways that ignoring form uh, you never get to, like poetry written, say, in the sonnet form. Sonnet, the constriction of the form presses on meaning and forces you to think about what you want to say. Um, you know, adding a, doing a braided narrative as opposed to a free form, uh, just chronological, breaking that apart. Sometimes you can get to other things when you think about syntax. Very interesting. But I was also saying how in reading, um, I always think of Mayakovsky, who was defending the avant garde, which was very avant garde during the revolution. And the revolution was becoming very conservative in terms of what art was for, what they thought art was for. It became very didactic, socialist realism. Art is for, aimed at the masses, for the improvement of the masses, to kind of galvanize their revolutionary spirit or their, you know, spirit of production for the future. And all this avant gardeness, all this playing with language, all this playing with form was elitist because it wasn't for the masses. The masses didn't understand that kind of art. So it was anti revolutionary, counter revolutionary to have avant garde art. And Mayakovsky said, well, he defended the avant-garde, which was really a house on fire at the time, um, as saying there's art for the producer and art for the consumer. And art for the producer is art to challenge the people who make art than for the masses. And that art, that big, art for the masses will stagnate and decline without the challenges uh, that the avant-garde art um, produces. So that in reading avant-garde art, you're stimulating the self that is then maybe all you want to do is write, straightforward realist fiction, but you can't help but be stimulated and challenged by this art that you're reading. So I'm reading this reader of Madeline Gins, Gins, which is avant garde to the max, and is giving me so many ideas, so many more ideas than a conventional novel of the type that maybe I'm writing. But it gives me that, it's like vitamins, it gives me that little can of spinach more that then I can trace through. So if you tend to write a conventional type of fiction, still it's worth exposing yourself to avant garde fiction, more challenging work, to kind of aerate the tank so you know what's possible. So then when you're making your choices on the syntactic level, uh, when you're making your choices on the formal level, you have a few more colors on your palette than you would have if you had just read people like yourself. Um, so I am. Uh, Sarah says I'm having unexpected flashbacks to linguistics in grad school now. Yeah, to be exposed to ideas and forms that you don't normally generate is super helpful to you. So Alicia has a question. So her question is, um, most novels seem to be in the third person. I started a book and it is first person, but since my character is a journalist, she observes a lot about others. Should I switch to third or stay in first? Well, this is every writer goes back and forth in first person, third person. Every writer will do both and then see which they like better. Um, First person is about voice. So if your character has an interesting voice, then first person is um, can utilize that voice. When you are in third person, you are in the author's voice. Um, so if your character has interesting voice, interesting take, um, then you would want maybe to, your choice of first person might be justified. If the character, that because there's a downside to first, which is your character can only see what they see, and they don't really organize the story the way a third person narrator does. Um, so, journalists generally write in third person because they're writing about phenomena, they're not writing about themselves. Um, I would say, hi, Bozena, I would say try it both ways for a chapter. See which you gravitate to. Does your character have, linguistically, have an interesting voice? Or are they just clear seeing? In which case, there's a lot of stuff you can get out of third person that you don't get in first. It's much more limiting in a certain way. So it depends on how interesting, um, the internal life of the character is versus the life of the story. Um, most novels used to be written in third person because the publishers preferred it. Um, third person past tense was the literary standard. And as we have gone along and we've gotten more into this idea, everybody has to, you have to speak for yourself. You can't know what other people are thinking. Um, there's been more and more interest in first person, more and more interest by writers, in writing first person, and less prejudice by the publishers against it. First person present tense is always a red flag for publishers because it tends to be new writers write first person present tense. And it gets tiring, and the more you see it, the less you like it. Um, on the other hand, if that's the way your novel's unfolding, I would just try it both ways and see which you like. Um, Hi, Peggy. Good to see you. So, does that help? Mm, if most novels you read are in third person, take a look at them and ask yourself, why do they pick third person? What do they get out of third person? What would I not write one of their paragraphs in first person and look at the difference and ask yourself, why do you think they chose third? Um, first person present is an amateur mistake, Alicia says. Um, it can be. Amateurs tend to do that. They feel uncomfortable with the remove of the third person, where they really have to deal with this as a character and not as an extension of themselves. But for that reason, it's a good thing to try. And if you're a struggling new writer, just learning and taking things on, experiment. But definitely take a book that you like that is in third person, try it in first and ask yourself, what does it gain, what does it lose? Why do you think that the author chose third person? Because it's always a choice. um, so Sarah says, are there certain genres that tend to use present tense more? I don't encounter it much in what I read. I think um, it's an action oriented voice. It's not looking at the story as it that it's already the story that's already happened. Um, and then picking out what to tell of that story. I'm going to tell you a story about what happened in 1960, and it's already complete. Whereas first person, as present tense especially, present tense, you're in the middle of the story, the character and the author and the reader. Uh, Nobody knows what's going to happen. Whereas in third person, especially in past tense, the narrator knows what happened. And so you are getting a shaped story. In first person, everything's coming at you, and people show up who may or may not continue in your story um, in the present tense. So you get more immediacy with present, but you get more confidence from the reader that you know where you're going in the past tense. Um, Bozena says first person can be more powerful when handled wisely. It has, it appeals because it's a puzzle. We, the reader, like the first person character, um, can only know what they know. So they're constantly butting up against what they don't know. They're trying to figure things out. In third person, we know what's happening for the most part. I mean, there's reveals and so forth, but we know quite a bit more in third person than we know in first. Um, but it can be very powerful to be locked into uh, a limited point of view of first, especially. It's vivid, but it's also, it struggles to encompass the world in a way that third person doesn't. Um, I so we're talking about character. This is interesting, talking about character, and we started off talking about person. Um, I got two questions out of the from came in from the interwebs today, and they're related. So I thought I'd do them both. So the first one is, how do you describe character, appearance, and personality within a short space when writing fiction novels? So fiction novels, you don't have to say fiction novels because novels are fiction. You don't have to say an ice cream frozen dessert because it's ice cream. All right. So, how do you describe character, appearance, and personality when writing fiction novels? And the other question that's related is, can you give some examples of how to describe a character's personality through behavior and action instead of just self description? And this is going to be super important um, in first person because are you aware of what you look like? I mean, we're on Zoom, so we're like, there you are. But um, generally, we don't think about our physical presence. Um, so in third person, it's easy enough to describe, Helen um, by the window, the light, striking her, the flat planes of her face like a Henry Moore sculpture, or pooling, on her rounded nose with a slight hook. Hi, Sinead, good to see you. Um, so the appearance is the first challenge, especially in first person. The old tired thing of going to the mirror, and you wake up and you're looking in the mirror, and my normal 30-year-old face, um, you know pasty, uh, with the folds from the blanket. My hair, I'm ready for a touch up, my chestnut is beginning to, show its brown roots, etc. I mean, in third person, it's pretty easy. In first person, you know, you have to decide how you're gonna catch yourself in a window. Try to avoid the big mirror, evaluation. They catch themselves in the mirror, but you include personality because that's the other question: is how do you describe personality as well as appearance? And in fiction, everything has to relate to the character, who they are. So character isn't a name. A character is a physicality. First of all, a human being. We have bodies and stuff. And the reader wants to be able to picture them. So um, I think that you catch a reflection in a mirror or you catch a reflection on the street. Sometimes it's kind of surprising when you see yourself reflected in a window and you don't look anything like you thought you did. Um, I'm shorter, older, fatter, it's grayer, or whatever. Um, or this coat is too bright for my palette complexion or whatever. Um, you can do it by people's reaction to your character. So I use that a lot. Um, I have a character who's was described by a landlord as, he would call her Ava Gardner. So we know that she looked like Ava Gardner, that she was sort of a sexy brunette. Um, you can have them in looking at somebody else, and then, her, my sister's hair, always was more, uh, had more of that golden glow that our mother had, whereas I was the mousier one. There's wonderful descriptions in, um, trying to think, I read so much, I'm just trying to, um, where a character described, oh, it was in the Baudelaire Fractal, one of my favorite books, and a first person, very internal, but she defines herself physically early on as undersized, mousy haired, glasses, um, in a very, uh, it's not here, it's upstairs, um, in a very succinct way. So these are little brush strokes. You don't have to sit and do a complete portrait of somebody's physicality because it builds. You'll have a little brush stroke or two, and then you'll have another one, another one. If you have I have a character who's walking through a flea market in Italy, and the vendors are calling out to her, and you can tell in the deference that she's an older woman, um, that they're choosing her in particular. Uh, she thinks she's just dressed in a skirt and sweater, but clearly it's a nice skirt and a nice sweater, the way the vendors are talking to her. And one vendor, here I go again, calls her out, Senora, oh, Vanessa, hey, Vanessa Redgrave, you know, she's, and she can say, Redgrave married an Italian. Nobody ever did this until Redgrave married an Italian when she was already silver haired. So instantly we get a little portrait of her without her having to look in a mirror and look at her, gray hair or whatever. Um, I have a character who is in a bar talking to some guy, and this is first person. She's talking to some guy, they're getting drunk, and she stands up. They're going to go dance. And she stands up, and he's a little taken aback at my height. You know, I'm 5'9", 5'10" in cowboy boots. Um, so I've just told the reader something more about her. But you can do it also with um, their behavior and action. So a character's personality and appearance. My character is very physical. She's handling some heavy stuff in her work. So we know that she's a strong person, not only tall, but um, really muscular and able to handle. Um, so we have some handle heavy things. So some sense of her physicality. Um, Her mother, of course, complains about her mess on her head, or she talks about her hair twining and hissing like snakes. So we know that she's got curly hair. Um, little bits like that. Um, the character's personality through behavior and actions instead of self-description is wonderful. I mean, if you could, if you have no narrator, if you're first person or close third, um, so you're not going to necessarily pull back and say, you can say, how lazy was he? Well, he was so lazy that blah, blah, blah. I had a boyfriend once who had a self-winding watch, and he was so still. He wasn't lazy, he was just quiet. But you could say so and so was so lazy their self-winding watch ran down because they didn't move enough, right? So you can do how lazy was he and use a metaphor. But this person is asking not uh, for a metaphor, but for actions and behaviors. So you don't have to say somebody's lazy. You can just say, are you, a character sticks their head in the bedroom and go, are you ever going to get out of bed? Oh, I don't think so. Not today. I mean, that tells you more about laziness because there's all kinds of laziness. But the person who won't get out of bed is not, I mean, that's bordering on depression. That's not just laziness, or it's a refusal. Teenager, the one that can't wake up, it's already after school and they just start waking up. They've just slept through their classes, basically. Um, that tells you something more from a teacher's point of view. You'd look at, McGregor or whoever it was and go, he's got his head down the desk and I swear he's snoring. Um, and how irritating it is to teach students who won't even pay attention. Um, so here are, you have some good ones here. Um, let's see. Um, so Sarah says a book I enjoyed has other characters calling the protagonist a Chinese Louise Brooks. It was set in the 20s, so very appropriate. Anna May Wong, was it? Um, so you instantly see that she's Chinese and that she's, a flapper and probably has that short hair. And it gives you a whole rundown. The danger of using comparisons like, you know, somebody calling her Vanessa Redgrave is that at some point you we will move into a world where people won't know who Vanessa Redgrave is. So you do have to back it up with other descriptions in other places. Um, a character short or tall, you have them unable to get they never can get their bag into the overhead. That's appearance, they have to climb on the chair, or they always have to ask somebody to help them with their bag in the overhead. But the same thing with being elderly. You're asking for help where you would never have asked for help before. And you don't have to say, God, I'm sick of being old. You just have to say, a young man helped me get my bag into the overhead. Ever since my shoulder operation, I just can't make that move. Um, to describe a character's personality through behavior and actions, we did the three-dimensional character study. which is in Lagos Egri's The Art of Dramatic Writing. Um, and once you know a character, say, what is their physicality? Are they energetic? Are they nervous? Are they super wound up? Are they laid back? Are they um, anxious? I mean, an anxious person will jump at a sound behind them, or an irritable person will be distracted by somebody unwrapping candy behind them, and get up a head of steam where somebody else might not. Um, uh, but the pace of a person's their physicality will tell you a lot about their pace. So how fast do they talk? How fast do they move? Are they distractible? They break things. They get in accidents. Um, uh, it's a better way to describe a person's personality through behavior and actions. Um, just the tone of it, the texture of them. A nervous person will like peel the label off their beer bottle. You know, they're always fiddling. Um, Whereas somebody can be extremely serene, and if you're not that kind of person, it can be unnerving. It's like, don't they ever blink? You know? um, Describing people's laughter uh, is very telling. So that takes a lot of observation. You watch movies and you try to describe or capture the sound of somebody's laughter, the sound of somebody's, um, just doing voices in general and having whole sections of your notebook just with voices that you can use for your own characters. So movies are extremely useful. You can pause them, and then start them again, you know, trying to capture different aspects of that character. Characters' posture, you know, are they square shouldered? Are they kind of stiff? Are they muscular? Do they have that uh, kind of strangled look of somebody who spends too much time in the gym, the big neck? They look immobile. They're strong, but, you know, could they run for a bus if they needed to? Could they, you know, dance a tango? You know? Um, so, yeah, so characterizing people's rigidity, people's um, like behavior. You have a shy person, they're looking everywhere but in your eyes. My husband, the comedy writer, has a math joke. How do you tell an outgoing mathematician he looks at your shoes instead of his? So that's the kind of thing that where action tells you about the person rather than saying, just having to describe them, their behavior, their character out, you know, saying he was a shy person. But you can always use metaphor. He was so shy that blah blah blah. Um, so the important thing about description, all description, including description of characters, is that you're never done. It's not something you can do in a huge chunk at the beginning of of introducing them and then never describe them again. You have to continue to describe them every time you see them, but in a different way. You can't repeat what you've already said. So this is where actions and behaviors become very important. Um, the way somebody crosses their legs, the way they listen to somebody they're not interested in. What do they do? So this is, definitely work with movies and TV shows and stuff where especially movies, where you're seeing people in action all the time, and stop and challenge yourself to describe that action. And then it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to use everything you get, everything you have in your notebook, the writer's notebook, the ring binder, but you've done the work. You've lifted that weight, and you get stronger at being able to do it every time you do it. There was a question that I had about AI, and what should I use AI for description? It's very hard for me to describe things. And I'm like, never use AI. That's not writing, that's copying. Um, Also, you don't want to train it on your stuff. You know, you know, hold the line, guys. Um, and then, learning to describe things. So you have to learn to describe, use the senses, and the same thing with describing character. You have to think of who they are, and then how would a person who is like that walk, talk, sit. How does a person who is bored sit? They tap, they do stuff, they check their phone, um, they detach in a million ways. A person who is, I mean, if anybody's ever taught a class, there are people who they're alert. The eyes, they have like genuine energy in their eyes, as opposed to people who are zoning out. Um, they look very different. And as a teacher, Zunaid, I bet this is true. Uh, you end up teaching to the people who are awake, and the other people are just furniture after a certain point. Um, uh, so here are some. Uh, Zunaid says, enjoying the debut novel of Hal Ebbott's Among Friends. And he quotes, avoid, this is me, avoid diagnosing your character. Show us who they are and how they react. Yeah, show them emotion. Um, yeah, I avoid, you know, uh, oh, my cat. Oh, well, he can sit for a while. He's kind of a taskmaster here. Um, yeah, I would rather see characters in action and doing things that show you who they are. Um, let's see, how to describe characters' personality through behavior and actions. Yeah. And then describing characters' appearance is always, it's a job, it's part of the job. You have to show who they are physically. I tend to avoid like things that don't show character. Somebody having blonde hair, so what? How does that show anything? You know, Whereas blonde hair, dark at the roots, tells you something. A beautiful girl is the hardest thing in the world to describe because it's been described a million times, and all that symmetry and big, beautiful, blue means nothing. It gives you nothing. Whereas if you have a beautiful girl with a chipped tooth, you can picture her. You can picture a kid who's fallen on a bicycle, an active person, a a person perhaps with either somebody who's so confident in their good looks that they don't fix that tooth. It just becomes part of them or part between their teeth. They don't fix it because it's part of them. I know the model Lauren Hutton has a big gap in her teeth, and they used to make her cap to get rid of the gap, but she didn't like it. She never got it fixed because for her that was her. There's a million pretty girls, and I don't care to be one of them. I don't care to be perfect. I don't care to be featureless. I am asserting myself. And Ali McGraw with that chip tooth. I mean, um, she had chip tooth, or she had, you know, anyway, something. Remember, her teeth weren't straight. Maybe there's a overbite or something. And it's like, I'm confident enough that I do not need to have perfect teeth. On the other hand, a chipped tooth that just is allowed to go on could be a marker for poverty. That you just can't afford to have that tooth fixed. And so she was a pretty girl, working in the diner with a chipped tooth. Um, so Sarah says, writing exercise, imagining Janet's cat as a person. Oh God, the bad boyfriend. Janet's cat, first person or third. First would be so boring because all he does is eat, want to go in, want to go out, try to kill something. Um, mm, Maybe a little bit more of a life, but in third person, very interesting. That's funny. So I have one more question that had been to talk about. Um, would you ever want to write a book about writing books? So I assume that at first, I thought, you mean a novel about writing novels? And then I realized, oh no, they just meant a book writing, a novel writing how to kind of thing, which I'm sure is in the future. I can't imagine not doing that. Um, but I think about novels about writers and about um, writing novels. Oh, that is interesting. Always, sometimes I think there are too many novels about writers um, because people have never done anything else. You know, Novels about writers because people have never, you know, done construction or they've never um, sewn clothing or worked a job, a straight job or whatever. A little too much insertion of self. But there are wonderful books about writers. Uh, and some came to mind, novels about writing novels. Um, there's a book that I recommend people check out just for the audaciousness of it, which is a book called I, the Divine by Rabi Alamenadine. Um, and it's all first chapters. It's a writer struggling to write a novel, and he just keeps starting over and writing a different opening, first chapter. The whole thing is first chapters, and he manages to tell the whole story as the first chapters accumulate. It's brilliant and about writing. Um, uh, All Fours, the new Miranda July, is about a writer who um, gets some money and is supposed to do one thing and ends up doing another. And her book, It Chooses You, that I've read recently, which is interesting on the syntactic, the formal level. It's nonfiction ish, but it's a writer who is having struggling writing what they're supposed to be writing, so they end up writing something else. Um, and I think most books that I like about with writers as the main character are writers who are struggling to write something and then end up writing something or doing something very different or writing something very different. Erasure by Percival Everett is about a writer who can't sell what he really does, and he gets very angry at what is commercially acceptable. So he ends up writing, what he thinks is the worst novel in the world, and then it turns out to be a great success. Um, Bright Lights, Big City, writer swayed by boring job and addiction and an obsession with an ex girlfriend. Fun movie, Alicia says. Um, Sarah says, so you're saying you would strongly consider writing a craft book somewhere down the road? Oh, yeah, it's bound to happen. It's just figuring out the voice, how I would tell it. I'm not big on rule number 10 rules to govern your life. It's like, really? Um, I think about The Wonder Boys, which is a book about writer's block. It's a block writer, and that's a big subgenre of writer books, major sub subgenre. You could probably say it is the genre. Writer books, people who can't write. And Wonder Boys is about a guy who has writer's block, and he's writing and writing and writing, and he can't get it to cohere. And that's the worst kind of writer's block. I've been there. And then there's a kid in his class who's like the native genius, and he kind of gloms onto that. That's a classic, Wonder Boys. Starting over and over again sounds like Gertrude Stein, like Cubist, the I the Divine. Yeah, it is sort of Cubist. I never thought of it that way. Um, Wonder Boys, Alicia says, great one. Um, then I think about The Golden Notebook, which is a very interesting book about, I don't know how it holds up, but I read it during the great journal writing period in the 70s, the Progoff journal method. Um, and we were in love with Anais Nin and her journal and the Ira Progoff, I forgot what it's called, um, but it was a journal fad, fashion, fad. The journal is never a fad, but there was a real interest in the journal. Um, and the Golden Notebook is a character who takes various parts of her life. She's a very unintegrated person. So she keeps different parts of her life in different journals. And then the Golden Notebook is an attempt to integrate the personalities. But I love the idea of, you know, different parts of yourself having different journals. Um, and Pale Fire is a book about authorly envy. So the translator, or was he the translator, the editor of a book of this poet's work, and the book is all in the footnotes as this guy starts to reveal his uh, crankiness and enmity towards uh, the other people who are academics around this poet. Definitely a must read. Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov. What else? Books about writers. Well, there's Misery, right? So Stephen King gets his writer and fan relationship. That's a good book. Um, I think there are lots of books that have that self-referential self. There's a name for it. Self-titled character who takes the same name as the writer. God, I read a Paul Auster like that recently. City of Glass, I think. Um, Not for me. It's a little too meta. It goes back and forth, but people like that kind of thing. Um, but there are writers, books that usually a writer between books or dissatisfied with their life, look what happens in Death in Venice. And that's a writer just kind of looking for renewal and ending up dead. No spoiler. That's a book worth reading. Um, I like books about work. I like books where people actually do things, make things. I think that writing is not a very interesting subject for fiction, the actual act of writing. Um, but the memories or what people get into can be very interesting. Um, what are your favorite books about writers or writing? I mean, there's so many of them. Books about living writer or, actual historical writers can be very good. Wintering by Kate Moses. I was just looking through that. Um, Kate Moses, is that her name? Anyway, it's a book about Plath, novel, and very well done. Um, Anybody have any other writers that fictional writers that they like to favorite books, fictional writers? They're inspiring. Well, in the absence of more of the writer Hall of Mirrors that those books can be, I will draw our um, session to a conclusion. Oh, um, the Whitney Otto, how to make an American quilt, about a uh, somebody writing a thesis on American quilts. Yeah, that was a wonderful book. So anyway, I wish you good writing. I can't recommend enough that you watch movies and capture gestures, actions that explicate character. Um, Stop it, right? You know, do some of that. And I wish you good writing. Thank you for joining me. Okay, bye.